Welcome, everybody, to this next installment of America in Prophecy. Now, what we're going to do is something a little bit different than what we normally do. What we're going to do is just focus primarily upon what we have established with the last broadcast, and that is the fact that the prophecies of Daniel, the prophecies of the book of Revelation, are pointing to a power that emerges after the 1260 years. What's fascinating is that John Wesley himself, back in the late 1700s, along with so many other Protestant reformers, believed that there was a lamb-like beast about to rise up because it was the end of the 1260-year prophecy. And people were looking to the end of the 18th century. The late 1700s was the expected time for the deadly wound to happen to the first beast of Revelation chapter 13, and that there was going to be a rise of this lamb-like beast coming from the land. What is fascinating is that I have here with me the commentary on the book of Revelation by John Wesley. And this was all accumulated from materials that he has written right around the 1760s. Check this out. This is his comment on Revelation chapter 13, verse 11, where it talks about, I saw a wild beast, a ram, a buffalo. And this is this idea that he's rising up from the land. What is amazing is that this is his comments. Out of the earth, and his assumption is that it's going to be Asia because China is called the land. So we're just thinking maybe it's the land. But he is not yet to come, though he cannot be afar off, for he is to appear at the end of the 42 months of the first beast. Now, he obviously took this as the year-day concept of Leviticus chapter 25. And the entire Protestant world was wondering about this new nation that was going to rise up, that was going to be this lamb-like beast. Fascinating enough is the deadly wound did happen. The Justinian Code did end. It started in 538. It ends in 1798. Wesley was right. It was on its way. But it was United States of America. And so this lamb-like beast that we've established, and we'll go further into it, we'll go into in our next broadcast, Daniel chapter 8, in much more depth, to establish the ram beast. And it's typified by a Persian liberator of God's people from a type of oppression of Babylon so that they may rebuild and point others back to the priestly administration and the reestablishment of the priesthood of Christ, and to look to him with imputation of righteousness through the merits of Christ, and broke those that were under the shackles of the papacy free to worship Christ freely and to come out from under a dominion, earthly, terrestrial, political class / ecclesiastical system, and pointed everyone towards the ministration of Christ's righteousness in heaven. The United States of America took a very central role in doing that. If you look at the explosion of the Bible societies in all the Protestant nations, but really exploded in the United States of America, where they were able to send Christian missionaries to the entire world in the late 1700s and in the early 1800s, with all the Bible societies literally distributing the Bible all over the world. And the spread of the English language really came from these missionaries teaching various people Christianity in English. And so, in order to teach the gospel, a lot of times it was just easier to teach people how to speak English, and they could teach them the gospel, and the gospel spread to the entire world. Well, it doesn't just end there. This is what's fascinating, is what we're going to look at is this lamb-like beast, this Christian-like beast, but it turns into a persecuting power. And what you're going to see is an apostasy of Christianity in this American new theology that develops from this interesting melting pot of ideas. You have humanism, Enlightenment movement, the Transcendentalist movement. You have Madame Blavatsky's work through Theosophy, the Theosophical Society. You have mainline Protestant teachings. You had these new spiritualized mystical groups. You had the Quakers, and eventually the Shakers. You had the Plymouth Brethren. You had various other ecstatic movements of experientialism and mystical experiences. You had Congregationalism, Unitarianism, all starting to develop. You had Jesuitism making its inroads everywhere throughout American society, through the colleges and universities. And what starts to coalesce and amalgamate is an image to that confused, amalgamated first beast, but done in the form and in the name of an apostate Protestantism. And we, ladies and gentlemen, are going to have to look at how that developed and what it looks like in the American new theology that has been exported to this world and has been tainted and is an image to the Catholic system. We're going to have to look at that. But let's look at actually the very deadly wound of that beast and the Protestant Reformation and the development of the understanding of the papacy as the Antichrist power and the desire to divert the minds of the people away from that idea. And they developed the Society of Jesus, which is called the Jesuits. Ignatius of Loyola was employed to take the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and all the other monks that were already seeing themselves as warriors to create a kind of Marine Corps of academics. And what was interesting is they developed colleges and they were pushing back the influence of the Reformation in countries such as Lithuania, Poland, Germany, England, France, all becoming Protestant. And so the way they did it was to influence through the educational system, through musicianship, ironically, to the history, creating acting troupes, bringing in the Greek tragedies. You had troubadours and minstrels. You had educators. You had infiltrators and imposters. You had people coming in through the political system and bringing these countries back under the heel of Roman Catholicism. This is history. Now, this became a highly developed system. It was called termiting. How do you just completely infuse and infiltrate the entire consciousness and the entire thinking in the intellectual society, the art society, at all levels? How do you bring it back to Catholicism? This was the very pursuit of the Jesuits. Well, these were those that had taken oaths. They came into high spiritual discipline, vows of poverty, extreme devotion to these concepts and ideas to defeat Protestantism. The Counter-Reformation movement was fueled by the Council of Trent, who breathed out more anathemas than any other document that the papacy ever constructed. Now, the Council of Trent, ironically enough, in some of my own Bible study groups, I have read the Council of Trent, and its main attack is upon justification by faith, how righteousness is imputed to the believer. Fascinating enough, when I have read the Council of Trent to various congregations and did not tell them that it was the Council of Trent, there wasn't a single eyebrow raised, and there wasn't a single person who opposed the very anathemas that were against imputation of righteousness and justification by faith. Universally, without opposition, no one saw a problem until I told them it was the Council of Trent and that it was the anti-Reformation, counter-Reformation document, the very playbook for the counter-Reformation. And then they, of course, went, yeah, of course we oppose that. Not understanding that counter-Reformation theology has already gripped the mind and the heart of the church, of the American church. And as you see in Revelation chapter 13, this lamb-like beast starts to persecute, starts to demonstrate itself in Pentecostal experientialism through the coming down of fire and miracles, and begins to speak like a dragon and emphasizes human theosis, human perfection, 666, human potential, human perfection, Arianism, the Ubermensch, the Superman doctrine, the hyper sanctificationist, perfectionist concepts through these mystical experiences. And this became a large part of the fabric of American theology. It's the fabric of Methodist, of Pentecostalism, of all the holiness movements, the Shakers, the Quakers, all of these holiness movements in which America saw itself as a Christian nation, as some new apostolic Calvinistic beast. It began to adopt, ironically, anti-Reformation, counter-Reformation theology. Now, the history of this is very fascinating because Bellarmine, Cardinal Bellarmine, at the time of the Reformation, was pushing the ideas of some of the literature that was developed by somebody called Francisco Ribera. The documents, the teaching, the theology that was developed to push back against justification by faith through substitutionary imputed righteousness that's separate from humanity, in which Christ alone bears this perfection as our representative in the heavenly sanctuary. There was a doctrine and teaching and a theology that was developed in direct adversarial attack against this idea. This is the very front line against the gospel of justification by faith, the stumbling stone in which Christ spoke and which Paul spoke. Francisco Ribera, Jesuit theologian, developed a doctrine called Futurism. Why? Because Orthodox true methods of biblical interpretation clearly identify through time, prophecy, and also through many other identifications, this apostate 42 months, 1,260 year engine that is political and ecclesiastical, infused, amalgamated, and called out as Antichrist and a harlot, was all clearly identified through the most orthodox means of interpretation, the Roman Catholic system, that created what we call, throughout the Justinian Code of 538, all the way through 1798, the Dark Ages, medievalism, the mystical 1,260 years. Francisco Ribera developed all the concepts of futurism to either focus upon first century fulfillment in preterism or in futurism, that there was going to be some kind of a European Antichrist power. He developed the concept of Zionism, in which there's going to be a literal fulfillment in literal Palestine/Israel. And Satan has done quite the job to give the appearance that that is the way that it's going. Now, there was a lot of attention, and I mean a lot of attention, in the late 1700s, when all of fundamental Orthodox Protestantism was not caught up in all of these holiness movements. I mean, sure, believing in overcoming sin, sure, keeping the law of God, sure, teaching historicism, but rejecting the Catholic church fathers, medieval churchism, all knew at the late 1700s that there would be a deadly wound upon the medieval church, that it had its reign and its power and its authority through the Justinian Code of Rome. Soon there would be a deadly wound. Napoleon comes upon the scene. It was already weakened through the Protestant Reformation and its teaching and its theology. And in 1798, when the Napoleonic Code was established and instituted, there was great concern as to this lamb-like beast that would cause all to worship the first beast, cause all to receive a mark in the forehead or in the right hand. And they were looking to identify this perfectionistic of humanity, theosis, divinization, mystical, ecclesiastical, apparently beginning as a Christian-like beast. Well, the concerns became excited. Prophecies were being fulfilled. There was a new nation called the United States of America that was rising up, saying that it had a special destiny, calling itself the New Canaan land, seeing itself in many ways as a New Jerusalem. Look at the development of Mormonism. Look at the development of all the churches that started to develop through Congregationalism, Unitarianism. The excitement in New England was palpable. Something exciting was happening. America just won its independence. There was a new age. There was a new day. This was a new world. This was a new England. This was a new France. This was a new Spain in the Americas. A new day and a new dawn, a golden dawn. What popped up? Ribera's writings. And who revived those writings? Manuel Lacunza. In the late 1700s, he went by a pseudonym, Juan Josephat ben Ezra, tried to kind of mask himself as a converted Jew. And what did he do? He wrote a very famous book called The Coming of the Messiah in Majesty and Glory, completely recapitulating the idea of futurism and the entire theological structure that is taught fundamentally by American evangelical world is completely laid out in Manuel Lacunza's work, completely. Now, how is that? How did we adopt Manuel Lacunza's work in futurism to draw everyone's attention away from the medieval church and the papacy and to focus upon this futuristic idea of Israel, of Zionism, of an apostasy coming from a last pope out of Rome, and a Jewish apostasy, and the building of a third temple, etc., etc. This all came as counter-Reformation theology to divert attention away from the Roman Catholic system. Now, Lacunza's work somehow was discovered by a man in England who became very fascinated with his work. Now, what's interesting is Edward Irving, who was a part of the Church of England, and he gave it up and started to fall into ecstatic experiences. The concept of speaking in a mystical language and would be flopping around all over the place and speaking in tongues, but he didn't see it as the biblical tongues in which you actually can speak a language that you never knew before, and you're going to go share the gospel counteracting the curse of Babylon, in which God is going to restore language so the gospel can go out. He moves into a mystical concept that was straight from Delphi, from Hinduism, from the Kundalini. He also believed and taught that Christ had a sinful nature and that he just received a Christ consciousness, that he received the Spirit of God that came forth from God, and he was anti-Trinitarian, and that he believed that Christ is the path, is the example for all of us to obtain to divine perfection. And so there would be this, quote, born again experience, a Gethsemane concept that he had, in which he believed that all men could obtain to the same divine humanity, God in the flesh, perfection as Christ, and that this would be necessary for the return of Christ, because he had been reading the work of Manuel de Lacunza. And he learned Spanish specifically to translate the coming of the Messiah in majesty and glory, so that he may spread this doctrine, because he was so excited about the concept that it was the end of time, to the people of England. And he started to develop these prophetic conferences. What's fascinating is that people like John Darby, and people we'll talk about later on, people that were very prominent in English and American society, were making their way to listen to Edward Irving, to take upon his ideas, and there was a great thrill and excitement in the air. And what was being adopted was the work of this counter-Reformation work of Francisco Ribera, transferred over to Manuel Lacunza, into the Futurism doctrine, completely absorbing this charismatic movement that was coming out of England and pouring itself into the United States in the late 1700s, just at the time, and in the early 1800s, just at the time as the deadly wound was inflicted upon the medieval church. And now starting the very roots of this American new theology that was Arian, that was Pentecostal in its ecstatic experiences, that was mystical. There was this concept of human divinization / theosis. Wesley bought into it. The Calvinists were buying into it. New offshoots were buying into it and falling into a spiritual sensualism and casting the atonement truth of substitutionary righteousness to the ground. What was also fascinating is that one of the biggest opposers, who was most concerned about this development, was Charles Spurgeon. He couldn't believe what was going on. This was a contemporary of Edward Irving, and he was seeing what was going on here, that this was a turning away from the atonement doctrine of substitutionary righteousness and putting the emphasis upon the experience of the believer, the mystical experience of the believer, just like the Desert Fathers, just like the Jesuits in their spiritual disciplines, just like Ignatius of Loyola. Jesuit doctrine was finally assimilated through apostate Protestantism. It was accepted in Congregationalists' church, and they started adopting all the same concepts of the friars, of the Franciscans, of the Dominicans. They started to develop these abbeys, asceticism, these spiritual disciplines and practices, and poured themselves into Nothing wrong with this, but they started to pour themselves into righteousness through social justice. And that's where you got the abolitionist movement. And that's where you got the suffrage movement. And that's where you get all the social rectification movement, because they didn't believe that God was in heaven, that God was manifest amongst people, and that the temple and the sanctuary was not in heaven, but in the believer, that God was made manifest through human flesh here on earth and expressing himself through social justice. Now, here's where it gets very fascinating. It's already fascinating. So what you have is now Darby was going over to these conferences. Now, so who is John Nelson Darby? Well, he developed what's called the Plymouth Brethren. And this is where Charles Spurgeon became very concerned as to what the development of things that were going on. Because now, this movement that was so fascinated with sanctification experiences and holiness and perfection, they started to reject justification by faith, imputed righteousness, substitutionary atonement. They started pushing predestination and that you cannot lose your salvation. There was such an over mysticizing of doctrine. They started pushing concepts of Futurism, Christian Zionism. It's very fascinating when Charles Haddon Spurgeon had tried to deal with this entire apostasy that was happening all through England and pouring itself into the United States of America and was catching like wildfire. Already being believed by Quakers and Shakers, already readily received by the Congregationalists and the Separatists, and then the Unitarians, who completely rejected the idea of the three persons of the Godhead because they saw themselves as the reality of God. They took on a very Platonic view, and all of this was influenced by there's only 28 universities at the time in the United States. 22 of them were run by the Jesuits. Very successful, turning American theology into a Jesuit theology without the label, but in essence, deadly heresies. There was a movement that was rallied against this idea. There was the Millerite movement. There were those that pushed back on these ideas because this was in no way, in any way, acceptable to John Knox or Martin Luther. All of them rejected these concepts of futurism. They heard of that doctrine. They already knew of Francisco Ribera's work. They knew that the Jesuits were pushing futurism and taking the heat off of not just the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. More than that, it was the soteriological teaching, which is the true apostasy. What is soteriology? Soteriology is basically, how are you atoned for? How are you saved? How is Christ's blood applied to the believer? And how does Christ mediate that righteousness? In other words, how are you saved? That's the real danger here. So many people focus on just the institution. They just focus upon time prophecy, identifying the institution. They will note atrocities and abuses as if that's the great danger of the harlot system. No, what is embodied are the oracles that will destroy your salvation. It is the dangerous heresy in theology of self, of gross humanism, experientialism, taught in the Catholic Church through transubstantiation, through mystical experiences, through asceticism, through pilgrimages, whatever it takes to get you into these high spiritual experiences. Go live in a cave somewhere, take a vow of poverty, to experience these great mystical personal transformations in your life. And in fact, the aesthetic life was very appealing to a lot of people in the Oxford movement with John Henry Newman, who himself was drawn away from Protestant theology and substitutionary atonement and found himself making his march to Rome perfectly, because he started to focus on experientialism and what about effectual justification? In order for God to actually say that you're righteous, don't you have to actually be righteous? John Henry Newman, Oxford University, right at the same time as all of these people, you guys, the apostasy heavily started to pour itself in the late 1700s because Satan wanted to bring in all the Counter-Reformation theology and wanted to activate it within the American system. And he paved the way with John Henry Newman and Edward Irving. High Church, John Henry Newman. Conservative Church, John Henry Newman. And he marches to Rome and becomes a Catholic cardinal. You could look it up. And then through Edward Irving, Christ's fallen sinful nature, perfectionism, speaking in tongues, holiness movement. That would be more the layman liberal side of the church. Good job, Satan. All based on human experientialism. Reality is the spiritualization, the divinization, and the process of theosis, an extreme view of sanctification, casting the truth of Christ's atoning sacrifice as our substitute and surety to the ground, trampling the sanctuary underfoot, and putting the emphasis in the human experience. Now, this became a part of the American theology fabric. So much so that when John Darby and the Plymouth Brethren, who is going to these prophecy conferences of Edward Irving and having these mystical experiences and bringing them back in the early 1800s, and there was a great called Second Awakening in the United States of America, and there was great religious fervor and kicked off the Victorian age of Puritanism. And all these experiences and all these fanaticisms and all the excitement and in all the crazy movements that started to develop in the early 1800s in the United States of America is on record. Campbellites, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baha'i religion. And they were looking at this original work of Lacunza, focusing on last day events to happen in Israel, futurism, and then focusing on the concept of holiness, perfectionism, experientialism, and great fanaticism took over the church. Now, we've looked at the succession. Francis Ribera, Counter-Reformation movement, right? Picked up by Manuel Lacunza in the 1700s. This was then picked up by Edward Irving and was being taught. And then what you had was John Nelson Darby, the Plymouth Brethren, bringing it to the United States. And who was going with him and who ultimately picked it up? Scofield. Now, what started to happen is that the Plymouth Brethren, this whole theological idea that came from the Jesuits, that came from the Counter-Reformation movement, John Darby, Scofield, is the very underpinnings of the Dallas Theological Seminary. Fundamentally, the hub the Mecca, so to speak, of American seminary headquarters. Fundamentally, D.L. Moody, all of these movements started to focus on this experientialism, what's happening in the body, what's happening in the person, theosis, not understanding that this is pure Jesuit theology. Not a revival and reformation, not an amazing revival of pointing towards Christ's high priestly ministry, imputing his righteousness to the believers. And then the gift of holiness is through the Holy Spirit as a down payment, as a first fruit, as a testimony to Christ's imputed righteousness. That's what imparted righteousness is for. It's wood, hay, and stubble. We're really unprofitable servants. In keeping all the law of God and perfectly reflecting his glory within our human sphere, we're still unprofitable servants, but that's not the emphasis of this other doctrine. They start calling our personal righteousness substance, reality, infusion of Christ's righteousness. This experience is the reality of Christ being made manifest again in the flesh, but through body ecclesiastical. It becomes a Platonic view of things, Plato's view. It's something in which Plato believed that humanity is the reality of God, in the expression of the better virtue, logos, and moving towards these more idyllic forms and ideas and making them manifest here on earth through human high ethical values and striving and achieving that, and going through a process in which ultimately man keeps striving higher and higher until a perfect society is reached upon this earth. And Catholicism took upon these ideas of Platonism, infused with philosophy, scholasticism, infusing Christianity with Greek philosophers, and the Greek philosophers got it from all the pagan religions of all of the world. We've covered that. The Greek philosophers came up with nothing themselves. 700 BC, 600, 500, all the way down to 300 BC, 100 BC, Greek philosophers were drawing all of their ideas from the mystical schools from the East. They made their journeys to Egypt, to Persia, to Babylon, to India, to China, all the way back to Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, Delphi. All mystical, all world religion ideas. Categorized, compiled into a system called scholasticism. All put in its bottles and in its under labels. And this is the essence of the educational system. That's why the entire educational system is a Greek system. Look at all the sororities and fraternities, Greek. In fact, we call it academia, and academia was the woods right next to the Greek pantheon, and that's where the philosophers taught, was in the orchards of academia. That's what it was called. And they would sit, and young students would go there, and it's an entire Greek system. A Hellenistic system was grabbing all these mystical, hidden mysteries, pulling them together, and making them available to initiated students. See, our law system is Roman. That's why everything's in Roman language for our law system. But all the educational system is Hellenistic, and Hellenism is just taking all the ideas from paganism of all of the world, all the mystical schools, gathering them together through Hermes or hermeneutics, pulling them together, finding the single strand through what's called Neoplatonism or syncretism, to syncing them all up together, and then teaching them and saying, well, Christianity is no different. It's the same as Babylonian teachings. It's the same as Zoroastrian teachings. It's the same as all the mystical ideas of Brahma teachings, of the Egyptian teachings. It's all saying the same thing. And this is poured into the doctrines that come through academia. And that's why it was so important for the Jesuits to develop the entire educational academic system, because that's how they brought Lithuania back after the Protestant Reformation. That's how they brought Poland back. That's how they brought Germany back. And they were working so hard on England, where you even had the Guy Fawkes and this whole anonymous mask that people wear. Well, that's a Jesuit plot, the gunpowder plot, to blow up King James's entire parliament while they were in session. And Guy Fawkes was the guy that was down there with all the barrels of gunpowder in this great Jesuit conspiracy to destroy an entire Protestant parliament. And they caught him, and they tortured him and found the other co-conspirators, and they hung them. And they have Guy Fawkes Day. And to this day, our society lauds the idea of being subversive, V for vendetta, subverting society. Jesuitism has been glorified. We'll get more into a lot of the movements that are happening today in Antifa, what happened with fascism, what happened in communism, what has happened in all these subversive political movements that have touched the religious life all over the world. Fingerprints are all over these things. As you're going to also see in our next broadcast, we're going to talk a little bit more about Scofield and all that, but just to give you a little hint is that our next broadcast, we're going to touch quite a bit on the fact that Daniel chapter 8 makes it abundantly clear that that Hellenistic power, that goat power with that single notable horn with great eyes and a mouth speaking great blasphemies, and Azazel, a scapegoat, a goat in which typifies Satan as the goat in the wilderness. The horn was broken off, and then it's broken into 4 pieces. And it is duplicating the idea of the 4 horns of the altar, and it decides to take over the entire world and to create this concept that homage needs to be paid to this power, this goat power, and it hates the ram power, the Cyrus power, the religious liberty power, the 2-horned animal power, the Re'em power. It hates that system. It hates Protestant republicanism that the United States was truly founded upon through its Constitution, Bill of Rights. That's what prevailed, folks, with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Protestant republicanism as not the official religion of this country, of the United States, but as the guiding principles. No country, no system was more hated by the Hellenistic little horn power, the Azazel goat power. Nobody hated the system, that lamb-like beast, 2-horned Cyrus power system, more than that goat power. And we'll really study it in our next broadcast. And I guarantee you, there is no love of the medieval Roman Catholic papal Jesuit system. There is no love for this country. There's a desire to subvert it, to overturn it, and to make it an image after its own nature, its own persecuting nature. And that is being perfectly played out in Revelation chapter 13. Unfortunately, this Jesuit theology of Francisco Ribera, which is the Counter-Reformation theology that was given to counter the Reformation, was pushed forward in all of its detail by Manuel Lacunza in late 1700s. John Wesley was saying, this deadly wound's about to happen. Berthier comes, takes the Pope, puts him into prison in France. Deadly wound to the beast, Napoleonic constitutional codes, and empowering of the people, representative government, a perfect model in the United States, actually given the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of liberty and freedom. But it wasn't long till that deadly wound was healed through fascism in the 1930s. Mussolini gives the power, gives statehood, international recognition through fascism, and call it fascism. Thinking that communism is any different is a fool's game. It is exactly what the medieval church was, and we just call it by different names now. Having commerce, having manufacturing, having all things that create trade and the state and ecclesiastical powers all fused into one idea, one entity, one concept is all fascism is all communism is all the medieval church was. It is a return back to the Dark Ages. Call it postmodernism, call it neo-fascism, call it neo-socialism. You could call it anything you want, my friend, and it's just a new label for an old product. We are making a steady march to medievalism in this nation that was founded on republicanism and the free ideas of Protestantism, of entrepreneurialism. And that's what happened in Europe when Protestantism finally flourished during the time of the Enlightenment. What did you have? Entrepreneurialism, people being free to earn, not being sucked away by the church and its greed, being bloated by its greed, where people have to live in poverty to show their spirituality. Well, what started to happen? These nations became high trade nations. Protestantism was actually the only competitor for Catholicism on the high seas. So what did Catholicism develop? Its proxy army called Islam, who was doing all the dirty work and the heavy lifting for the papacy. This was all developed back in the 7th century. And it was the impetus for gaining land all over the world, and all the papal bulls in which you had the Justinian Code legitimizing the papal bulls, saying that they could take any land anywhere on this planet because they're chasing down Islam. And they were allowed to receive what's called the booty or whatever they took. But the deed to the land was to always go to the papacy, and that was always the way it worked. Well, Protestantism shows up and becomes a fierce competitor in the spice trade, textiles, metals. And all of a sudden, there was war during the Dark Ages, post-Protestantism, on the seas. So the proxy armies of Rome was Islam. Now, what's fascinating is that that's what the pirates were. I was just speaking to someone recently who is so immersed in this history. I've spent time in this history myself. I've got all kinds of books. But the slave trade system was run by Islam. Africa trade slave system was run by Islam. And there was Catholic systems that was buying them from the West Coast. Only 10% was being bought by the Westerners. 90%, they were used in armies, and all those slaves that were captured in Africa, the millions upon millions and the hundreds of millions that were captured, mostly went up towards the Ottoman Empire and mostly went out to the Indian Ocean. And most died. Women became part of harems. Men were conscripted into the armies or became servants in giant palaces or built roads or bridges and developed the entire economy of the East. 10% were sold to Westerners. A handful were dominionist Protestants, mostly Catholics, to develop the new world's textile industry with cotton. Also, there was the tobacco industry. There was the rumor of gold. And all of this was coming out through the Gulf of Mexico and into the Caribbean and making its way back into Europe. I only bring this up that a lot of people don't understand that even the propaganda today as you see in Pirates of the Caribbean, the good guys are the Islamic pirates. Have you noticed their swords, noticed their dress? And who are the bad guys? The English Protestant traders. Not understanding that this was a proxy war against Protestantism. Protestantism was trying to develop the economy. There was already a worldwide oppression. There was a yoke already placed upon the world through the Justinian Code, through the doctrine of discovery, dum diversas, and we named so many of these papal bulls that put a yoke upon this planet. And people don't understand that even today, the minstrels of the Jesuits are still playing, and we're still cheering on the Islamists in the Pirates of the Caribbean. To be a swashbuckling pirate is to be anti-establishment, right? And we've romanticized the anti-establishment, anti-hero, and iconoclast. So these ideas of romanticism and feelings and deconstructionism and subversive literature and the worship of depraved art and deconstructive intellectualism, and it's very fascinating. When you get into, they have this thing, it's very fascinating, that they taught the Jesuits. And if you're taught through Jesuit schools, there's this way to get out of trouble called casuistry. It's a very interesting word, but it's a process of reasoning that seeks to resolve moral problems by extracting or extending theoretic rules from a particular case and reapplying those rules to new instances. In other words, it's deconstructionism. You gut something of the original context, you apply it in the situational ethics to another situation, and you could justify anything. So you could lie for any reason and not feel like you're lying, because this method occurs in what's called applied ethics jurisprudence. The term is also commonly used as a pejorative to criticize those of clever but unsound reasoning, especially in relation to moral questions and sophistry. In other words, this was a technique that was being taught in university through literature, through art, through acting, through music, as a way to justify anything that you do in what we are so frustrated with today, a thing we call a double standard. No insight into yourself. What's good for you is not good for the other person. In other words, you could be a total walking contradiction. You could be everything that you yourself judge. You could say, well, I believe that you're a fascist, you're a Nazi, you're a whatever, you're a bigot, you're a homophobe, you're this, and say, wait a minute, that's you, that's who you are. Well, this thing, this casuistry was a actual ontological teaching that was taught to all Jesuits. And in all Jesuitical schools, it's the idea that you don't have to be accountable to an unchanging moral standard, because it's all to be deconstructed. It's to all find its new meaning in whatever you decide to inflate a meaning or de-inflate a meaning or deconstruct an idea or to reconstruct it over here. In other words, you can look at truth, you can deconstruct it, attack it, and turn everything on its head, and you could still keep your conscience clear. And this was a technique used for people that would be deceptive, that would be blatantly, quote, criminal in what they're doing. And it was a way in the canon law, in a way of, quote, being right before the church, that there's a way to be right before the medieval church. And that was this process that if you could explain it through these philosophical arguments, through these polemics, that you can have a clear conscience. We all know there's not a single Christian that I know that believes you're going to get away with this with God, but this was a fascinating tool for those who love to rationalize hypocrisy, who love evil and want to not live with their conscience bothering them. This word that you never hear used, but is constantly being taught, not the word, but the concepts in ethics classes, in philosophy classes. It is the constant indoctrination that runs through and through at every level of all the liberal arts, of all the humanity courses. When you have the deconstruction of genderism, when you have the deconstruction of a society, when you have a two-tiered system of justice, it's all based on this. And we think nothing of this word. This word means something. This was the very horse that the Counter-Reformation movement was based upon. They said, you could go ahead and do everything that's evil, and you could use this rational process and still be right with the church. And if you're right with the church, you're right with God. If you're right with medieval church that's here upon this earth through its human system, because supposedly there was just this apostolic succession that can't be undone. Fascinating thing is that this form of rationalization was picked up on the teachings of Romanticism that has been infused into the consciousness and glorified in all the arts and in all literature. Feelings, emotions, urges, animalism, base core passions, whatever flares up in your soul, to trust your soul. Now, this is the essence of this experiential spirituality, in which you deify that which is base from a sinful nature, from your core being. All you have to do is just give it a spiritual label. And so this is where it's in apostate Protestantism. This is where it's in Catholicism. This is where it's in secular society. Our society has been spiritualized. There is a sophistry. There is a philosophy that permeates, and it feeds the natural man and justifies the most basest human nature. And this has been glorified as American free will, as Romanticism. Deconstructionism, worshipped in music, in the arts. And then we're looking at living contradictions, and then you try to call it out, then casuistry. And we are sitting in the midst of an American theology that has been exported through a sensualized spirituality with an eschatology that was literally constructed as an anti-Reformation theology, an anti-counter-Reformation eschatology and end-time events. And it has been pushed through this American new theology. Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth, Tim LaHaye in the Left Behind series. And in fact, after 9/11 is an interesting observation. When people used to walk around Washington, D.C., and all the politicians, they would have books of philosophy that they'd be carrying with them as they're kind of going about their business. Do you know what they noticed after 9/11? People were carrying Tim LaHaye books. And they were building foreign policy on Francisco Ribera's ideas, on Emmanuel Lacunza's ideas, the stuff that Robert Bellarmine, back in the Reformation time, was pushing, saying, hey, listen, this is what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to get this eschatology into the minds of the reformers to take identification away as the Antichrist power, as the harlot power that sits upon the beast. The focus is going to have to be off of us and move to some future idea, future concept. It is amazing to me that sensualism takes a hold of Edward Irving. He deconstructs the Trinity. He now says that Christ had a fallen, sinful flesh. and that he was brought to theosis, perfection, deification, human potential, perfectionism, through radical spiritual sanctification experiences. And if that's the way to salvation, that's perfection. And then, once it was exported to the United States of America through Scofield, popularized as the commentary through the Bible Belt in the Scofield Bible references, completely adopted as normal because of the American sensual holiness movement through Pentecostalism, through this experientialism, totally the American experience, seeing itself as this exceptional nation with this new idea, with its own new theology. It becomes a second beast power. Not so much unlike medieval church with its international ambition to convert the world to its dominion theology. Now through Christian Zionism, through our support of Zionistic Israel, and taking the entire foreign policy blueprint from Francis Ribera, Manuel Lacunza, Edward Irving, John Darby, Scofield. We took it hook, line, and sinker. We bought into it. It's not even questioned. It's not even aberrant. We don't even say this is heterodoxical. We don't even have a question mark around it. And in fact, if you question this, you're the heretic. This is counter-Reformation eschatology that was pushed clearly and delivered deliberately to deconstruct true Protestantism, to lead us back into the only righteousness that is acceptable before Christ, and his second coming is going to bear testimony to those who believe in Christ's imputed righteousness, standing in place of themselves as their heavenly high priest. Yes, there will be correlating sanctification. Yes, there will be correlating obedience. Yes, it will be a testimony to his righteousness. Yes, it will be a down payment in which we'll be keeping the commandments of God, but we will be as unprofitable servants. Our sanctification is only what? Evidence of imputation, fruit of substitutionary righteousness, pointing towards us as the substance, us as the reality of righteousness. Never, never let those words escape your lips. Such blasphemous treason in heresy, creature merit through infusion, through theosis, through divinization, through mystical experience. Desert fathers, apostasy, Neoplatonism, sensualism. How far are we going to go in this apostasy? When will the name of Christ be lifted up as our only true person of righteousness standing? When are we going to lay a hold of the veil of the anchor that's within the second veil? When are we going to say, look not upon me, but look upon him who is my righteousness? I have a righteousness which is by faith alone, in my Savior alone, in Christ alone. Look not upon me for the source of life and righteousness. Look upon him who is my Savior. Even the life of obedience points us away from ourselves and into him, because it's a life of self-renunciation. It's a life of don't look upon me. It's a life of like, no, I am not the reality of righteousness. I only live a life of obedience because I'm here to be a practicing citizen of walking the streets of gold in the presence of angels. And they're all going to be keeping God's commandments, because God's commandments will be upon each person's heart and soul. Never as a way to obtain the righteousness, never the offering of Cain. Evidence of what we've received in our substitute? Absolutely. But never to confuse the two. All right, that's it for this broadcast. I'd like to thank you for joining me in America in Prophecy. Join us next time for this next installation. Looking forward to seeing you then.